But this week we're going to be hearing about clinical research trials. And I thought that just to change it up and not have me standing up here in a very boring way reading somebody's CV, I would have a little bit of a conversation. So Marta, if you would switch places with me.
I'd be happy to.
That would be great. So this is, it would help if I actually turned on. So this is Marta Hayden. Marta, tell me about where you went to school and what got you interested in the kind of work that you do.
Does this work?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I went to several different schools for nursing school. I went to Del Tech for my first degree, and then I went down to University of Maryland for my RN to BSN, and then I went to Wilmington University to get a degree in nursing leadership with a focus in education.
Great, great. So following up after Rick Cumming last week.
Exactly. It's interesting when you see the trajectory that many of us went, and it was a lot of fun doing it that way because it's learning just in time. When you're ready for the next bit of information, it's right there for you.
Right. And when did you know, given that a lot of the people in the group are high school and younger folks, when did you know that you wanted to pursue this career?
Well, my mother was a nurse, and she did not encourage me to go into nursing, never said a word about it. When I was looking for a career, I spent about 2 years thinking I would do secretarial work, and took a few courses, learned how to write shorthand. That's how long ago it was. And one day I was reading something about nursing, and I thought, you know, that is exactly what I want. I want to be able to do many different things with the education that I get, and that's exactly what I've done. I've had the opportunity to practice in a number of practice areas. I taught at a community college for almost 10 years. And I've been in cancer research since 2011. So it's really been fun trying on different hats.
Right. Okay, I'm going to get your slide deck up, and I'll turn it over to Marta Hayden. From beginning.
From beginning. All
Marta,
right. Thank you so much. All right, just to start out, I'm not drinking beer. This is seltzer water. My students at Cecil always thought the first day of class that I was drinking beer, so I promise you I am not. All right, I've been playing with the technology a little bit, so hopefully I'll know which buttons to push when. And this lecture, of course, is about clinical trials, and it's the basics according to Marta. You would probably get different basics if you had a different lecturer up here, because there are so many aspects of clinical trials that you have to grab a bit of it here and a bit of it there, because couldn't possibly cover it all in an hour and a half. So this talk is dedicated to the researchers who create the knowledge, the clinicians who practice it, the teachers who spread it, and the students who learn from it. And that's who you would be. So thank you all so much for being here. It's very exciting to see such a packed room. The aim of science is not to open a door to endless wisdom, but to put a limit to endless error. And as we all know, humans are prone to endless errors, and we need guidelines and regulations and a lot of brains to find our way outside of those errors. And that's exactly what clinical trials do, is they take the big mess conglomerate of the world, focus on a small problem that has to do with human beings, and brings the prism of light directly onto that problem in order to solve it. And it does keep us from making errors. So I'd like to just give you a little bit of a background here. Why why are clinical trials important? Well, this is a graph that you can see has to do with cardiovascular disease. Along the bottom, and it might be difficult for you to see, so let me explain it. Along the bottom it begins at 1950 and ends at 2015. And along the left side is the death rate per 100,000 people in the population. You can see the top line is cardiovascular disease, or CVD. The next one down is coronary heart disease, and the bottom line is stroke. So you can see in 1950, cardiovascular disease, we were losing over 800 people per 100,000 every year to cardiovascular disease. And you can see it stays kind of even until we get to about 1970. And then we start to have some precipitous drops there until it comes all the way down to almost the 200 level. Think of that, from 800 to 200 deaths out of 100,000 people. This is in the US. Think of how many lives have been saved. Now, I can't claim that clinical trials had everything to do with that, because it obviously didn't. It's multifactorial. There were changes in environment and pollution and eating habits and a lot of different things. But much of what this is related to clinical trials which defined what the risk factors were that could be modified. The main one was hypertension. When they started controlling hypertension in the 60s, that's when things started to go down. So in 1950, they didn't even think hypertension should be controlled unless it was completely out of control in a younger person. So think about what a dramatic change, going from about 700 deaths a year per 100,000 all the way down to 200. And much of that did have to do with controlling hypertension through medications and lifestyle changes. And clinical trials were what proved that those were the appropriate changes. Another important advance that we have seen has been in childhood leukemia. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia in children is a deadly disease. It is generally fatal if left untreated. It is unrelenting and just extraordinarily difficult. Back in 1950, the mortality rate was 100%. Now, we have 90% of children being cured from ALL due to clinical trials and people who participated in clinical trials in order to show that these medications, chemotherapy medications, worked. Now, obviously, 90% isn't good enough. We're talking about children, sick children. We need 100%. So we continue to work very, very hard. And we're just opening an ALL trial for adults over at the Helen F. Graham Cancer Center right now. So this is an amazing improvement, but we're going to keep on working. And that's why it's good for everyone to know about clinical trials and get involved in them if they have a disease or disorder. Everybody's going to have the ooh factor here. So there is a terrible infection called C. difficile, or Clostridium difficile bowel infection. It is an awful thing to have. It causes painful, bloody diarrhea. And sometimes it doesn't go away. It becomes chronic. And people with this chronic infection really have a tough time of it. Up until they started talking about fecal transplants which has been maybe in the past 10 years, all we had was oral antibiotics to give them. That only cured about 30% of the people. So 70% of the people who had the bad fortune of getting this infection were stuck with it for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Now, studies, and this is just one of several different studies, you can see it had a very small number of patients, that should be a small n, 43 patients, but they did a rectal infusion of a healthy person's donor feces, and it resulted in an 80% cure at 10 weeks. 80%. So when you think about that, you think, oh, it's disgusting, but that's fantastic. If I had C. difficile, I'd be the first person in line. So that's some very good news. Now, this is a study. The Women's Health Initiative looked at hormone replacement therapy for postmenopausal women who still had a uterus, and they put them on estrogen and progesterone. It was a randomized clinical trial. There were 16,000 women in it. That's a lot of women. That's a big study. And half of them got hormone replacement therapy, and half of them got a placebo. And we'll talk about placebos in a little bit. So placebo just meaning that it was not hormone replacement therapy. So when the results of this started coming out, they do something called an interim analysis when clinical trials are going on. And every sponsor of a clinical trial, whether it be the National Cancer Institute or Bayer or AstraZeneca, they are required to at least yearly pull together a committee of people who can look at the scientific merits and the data that's starting to come in and make sure it's still safe and that we should continue with the study. Well, at one of the interim analyses for this study, they said, wait a second, these results that we're seeing so far tell us that there is an almost 30% increased risk of cardiovascular disease, greater than 100% risk of developing a blood clot or a venous thromboembolism, and 26% increased risk of invasive breast cancer. So we've got to get these women off this hormone replacement therapy. It's very dangerous. So they halted the study. They let everyone know which option they had been on. Had they been on HRT or had they been on placebo? And they put out news reports. And those news reports went out far and wide to women in the US and Canada. And women's doctors' phones started ringing off the hook. They wanted to speak to their doctors, should I stay on hormone replacement therapy or should I come off? Women are usually pretty proactive about their health. You know, that's just part of our makeup. And women thought, hey, they're saying HRT is dangerous, we have got to stop it. So they called their doctors, they came off hormone replacement therapy, and it made an incredible change in the practice of prescribing hormone replacement therapy for postmenopausal women. So let me get into just some nomenclature here. There is basic or bench research, which if you all have been coming to mini medical school for a while, you've probably heard Dr. Kaimek. He is a wonderful speaker, and he is over at the Helen F. Graham Center, and he is using CRISPR technology to do amazing things, inserting normal genes into damaged DNA in order to cure cancer. So he is practicing somewhat at the basic or bench research level, where they are just looking for knowledge. They're looking for information. And this is done in a laboratory, and that's why they call it bench research. They're working at the bench, and they're taking copious notes of everything they do and everything they see in their studies. Now, translational research, and Dr. Kaimek is kind of going in that direction. Translational research is called bench to bedside. And what that means is taking the knowledge that bench researchers or basic researchers are discovering and trying to form the pathway to getting it to a patient's bedside so that that knowledge can be useful and helpful to our communities. So it might be something where they're applying a new medication or a new treatment to a cell culture or an animal model, something along those lines. And then clinical research is what I do. So clinical research is all about working with people to answer scientific questions. So I am the clinical research manager for NCI trials over at the Helen F. Graham Center, and we have a number of clinical research trials and different types going at any given time. We usually have about 80 to 100 trials at any given time. So we typically don't do epidemiology studies. That is studying disease patterns. The CDC does a lot of this. A lot of federal agencies do a lot of this. And then there's behavioral clinical research, which might be done by a psychologist or a sociologist. But it's understanding human behavior and looking at how we can influence human behavior in order to improve health. Now, the next one, health services. This is getting interesting. It looks at how people access healthcare providers, how much cost there is involved in being treated for something, how different care delivery systems work. So if someone has cancer, our delivery system over at the Helen F. Graham Center, you can come in several different ways. Someone can just call the main desk and make an appointment at what is called our multidisciplinary center. They can also go directly to a surgeon in the Helen F. Graham Center, or they might go directly to a medical oncologist there. So there are different ways to approach care, and we're always trying to figure out how can we make sure that people are getting everything they need. If they go to the surgeon, are they also going to get a nutritional consult? Things like that. But the most interesting thing that's been going on is a new term has been coined, and it's called financial toxicity. I just love that. They took something that we all know so well and gave it such a great term. So financial toxicity means, of course, your pocketbook being hit heavy by disease. We have a trial open right now for people who have colon cancer, and we are tracking how devastating it is to their pocketbook to have colon cancer. And we're going to be able to use that information to influence public policy in the future. So I think it's really important because, I mean, if anyone in this room has had cancer or has been very close with someone with cancer, you know that the financial part of it is just devastating and makes it so much more difficult. It's almost a full-time job to handle your insurance issues and getting everything pre-approved and all of that. So I think this is something that's going to be really useful. And then there's just plain old clinical trials, which evaluate an intervention that we offer to someone, and we measure how it affects their health after the intervention. So clinical trials, they can study a lot of different things. Typically, though, the most common is to study a new drug. Now, we don't just give the person either the new drug or nothing. We follow what's called standard of care when we have people participate in clinical trials. We determine what the normal standard of care is for that disease, and that might be what we call one arm. It's kind of the option, but it's an arm. And this is, and you would be randomized to one arm or another arm. So you might be put in the group that is just getting standard of care, which, let's say for colon cancer, might be a certain cocktail of chemotherapy drugs given a certain way. The second group might get that cocktail, exactly the same as the first group, but along with a new medication, or a different dose of the previous medication, or a different way of administering it. Instead of giving it IV, maybe they found it can just be given a little shot in the arm. So they're going to compare apples to apples so that no one would ever be offered a trial that would not include what the standard of care already is. Now, there are a lot of studies on different ways of doing surgery. New medical devices. I certainly, when I get to be 70 and I get my hip replacement, I want that to have been well studied, and I want to make sure that it works properly and that somebody has been checked off on that. New ways to use existing treatments, changing behaviors to improve health. Some of the things that we might try to get someone to do. We had a very interesting study, although I think it was a tough study for people to be in. People with a cancer diagnosis who were undergoing chemotherapy, they were asked to exercise every single day, whether they felt like it or not. And some days they really didn't feel like it, and they kept a diary so that we could assure that they did do their exercising, and encouraged them to be honest, even if there was a day they skipped, whatever. We could, you know, all that can come out in the analysis. But it did show that people getting chemotherapy or radiation therapy under treatment for cancer do better if they exercise every day, even if they don't do a lot. But every body has to move every day. You've got to put a certain amount of movement out there or you're not going to do well. And exercising mildly to moderately actually really improved the outcomes of people with cancer treatments. And now some of the different types of clinical trials. We can, of course, do prevention trials. You know, there was a trial adding, I think it was vitamin E to see if it would prevent prostate cancer. It didn't. So they got that out there, It's done, and we don't have to revisit it. We know it doesn't really change anything. Now, screening trials can be really interesting. Here at the Cancer Center, we participated in a lung cancer screening trial. People who had smoked for a number of years were asked to participate and have it's called a spiral CT scan. It's a low-dose CT scan, so there's not a lot of radiation involved. And these folks who went through the screening, if they had a tumor, it was found at an early stage, and it could be surgically removed and cured. And this is now common practice. So trials that we participate in right here are actually having a big effect on what people do around the world. And spiral CT scans are saving lives. Another screening trial we've got going on right now is called TMIST, and we're comparing 2D mammograms, which are called digital mammograms, with a 3D mammogram, which is tomography. Tomography is it's kind of like making a movie as the camera goes through the layers of the breast. So it is making like slice x-rays, and then when they put them together, you can kind of watch a movie as it goes through the breast, so that the radiologist doesn't have to look at all of the dense breast tissue all at once. They can look at slices of it. And of course, we all think tomography is going to be a better way to do it, but we don't know. And it costs more. It certainly has more radiation exposure. So we don't want people to have radiation exposure unless there's a clear benefit for it. So we're participating in this TMIST study, and they are looking to accrue 165,000 women in the US and Canada. So I'll tell you about this in a few years. It's going to take a while. Diagnostic trials. Has anybody in here ever had a CAT scan? Okay. How about a PET scan? Okay. How about an MRI? Okay. We have trials for all three of those modalities right now, where we're testing special ways to do them for different diseases. So for a PET scan, they're actually finding that they can attach the nuclear medicine tracer to an estrogen-like molecule, and when they inject that into the body, it will go to a breast tumor, even if that breast tumor has traveled and metastasized in the brain or the spine, so they can see it so much better. CAT scans, they're looking at CAT scans that can measure blood flow. There are just so many things going on with this. It's really very cool. And then treatment trials, of course, we've talked about that, behavioral trials. And supportive care trials are important because we're looking to relieve some of the discomfort and suffering that people go through when they have cancer. I don't care what anybody says. Some people really do suffer from nausea or pain or psychological discomfort. It is hard to have cancer. It is not something that you don't want to be without support. And so some of these supportive care trials address those issues. Now, trials are all done in phases. So when we talk about a phase 1 trial, really what they're trying to do is establish that that drug is safe for people. The previous stop was in animals. So now we're in people, and they're trying to determine that that drug is safe to give people. They start at a very low dose, and they very slowly increase. and they're trying to identify side effects. So phase 1 trials include pilot studies, sometimes I'll call them a safety lead-in, but there's something else called first in human. Did anybody see the first in human show that was on TV? No, okay, good. My resources at the end you will definitely want to look at. First in Human is a documentary about the NIH down in Bethesda and their clinical center. And it's about real people with real cancers or sickle cell or, you know, whatever. And they're going down there to join a study that is a phase 1 study, first in humans. And this TV show it'll just knock your socks off. But all you have to do is search for first in human, and you'll be able to see it. I did have a clip from it, but that clip does not want to play, so you won't get to see it, I don't think. However, it is a wonderful documentary, and you'll learn so much about some of the new technology and about what people go through when they're on clinical trials. It was very interesting. Now, phase 2 trials, that's going to be in a slightly larger group of people, usually like 100 to 300 people, as opposed to a small group of, 40, 50, 60. And they're looking to see now, is it effective for that cancer? Whereas in a phase 1, they have a guess. They think it's going to be effective, but they don't know. So now they're actually looking for effectiveness and along with safety for side effects. When it gets to be a phase 3, that's a large trial. So that's usually, I know I have 1,000 to 3,000 there, but I would say nowadays things have changed a little bit, and probably 500 to 3,000 is what we see for a phase 3 trial. And that is when we've seen some effectiveness for the drug or the treatment in the disease, and we're really trying to fine-tune how it is administered, how well people tolerate it, and comparing it with the standard of care. And phase 4 trials are kind of done after a drug is released, after the FDA has approved it and it's being marketed. We really don't have anything to do with those because that's all aftermarket research. And that's when, say, we all of a sudden got the notice that NSAIDs cause cardiovascular disease, or that they were linked with cardiovascular disease and probably a cause of it. So we didn't know that when it was initially approved by the FDA. But Vioxx, that was taken off the market. People have been warned about taking Celebrex. People have been warned about taking ibuprofen. Too much of those drugs does cause cardiovascular effects.
What's the timing on each of those phases? How long?
That's a really good question. It can take, unfortunately, a ridiculous amount of time to get a study approved and up and running. So if we are looking at a phase 1 study, we have a lot of combo studies now, so let me give you a real example. We have phase 1, phase 2 studies, and it starts out as a phase 1, and we might only nationwide accrue 12 people to that. That might take anywhere from 3 to 6 months to accrue that many people. But there's probably a year of work prior to that just to get the study up and running. Then a phase 2 would typically take 1 to maybe 2 years, and a phase 3 could take up to 10 years. So this is my first in human clip, and I know it doesn't work, so glad I got here early so it wasn't a surprise. Sorry. So we need to talk about potential benefits for participants, because why would anybody do this? What's the point? What would entice you to participate in a clinical trial? Well, a well-designed and well-executed trial can be a wonderful thing. Some of the benefits are that you might get access to a new drug or a new treatment that isn't FDA approved yet. But if it's a phase 3 trial, we probably know, hey, this is going in that direction and it's working for that. Our research team is a devoted team of nurses and doctors. The doctors are all volunteering their time to do cancer research. Of course, the nurses are on the Christiana Care payroll, but we are all there just to help research participants. So if you go onto a study, you're going to hear from a nurse more often than you normally would. You'll probably get sick of hearing from your research nurse. That's just the way it goes. But we are very careful about monitoring for every possible side effect, making sure you get treatment if you have a side effect. Those things are really important. But apparently there is something in people, it's altruism, and they want to help others. And I have heard so many people say that this might not help me, but I know it'll help the next generation, or it might help the next person with breast cancer. This altruism is one of the most touching and beautiful things I have ever seen. It is a gift if someone participates in research that they know might not even benefit them. And they do it out of the goodness of their hearts. And so we should be just in awe of the fact that anyone volunteers. Potential risk to participants. This is a little bit more worrisome, of course. There can be life-threatening side effects. There was a case, there was a young man, I think he was 17, Jesse Gelsinger, and he was a patient up at Penn, and he had a rare enzyme disorder. His DNA did not make an enzyme that his body needed. And he participated in a gene therapy study. This has been, I don't know, more than 15 years ago. And this gene therapy study sounded very promising. And the consent form that he signed made it all look rather benign, not worrisome. Come to find out that prior to him getting this gene therapy, 2 animals had died in animal studies. 2 monkeys had died. In addition to that, a couple of other people who had received this gene therapy before him, because only a handful of people got it, they had had side effects that were rather severe and had to be medically treated. A third problem, the doctor had stock in the company, making the gene therapy. None of this was disclosed to Jesse or his family. Jesse became ill after he received the gene therapy treatment, and he died within a week. It was stunning to the research world. It was sickening, and it was further proof that we need more oversight and regulation. So over the years, we have gotten more, doctors and all people working in research now have to reveal if they have any stock in any company that they're working with a clinical trial with. They have to recuse themselves from working with any patients on that clinical trial. And many other safety nets have been put into place, but that was stunning to lose someone. And then I remember in Baltimore, there was a healthy volunteer who had asthma, and they gave her some type of medication or treatment, and she had an immediate allergic reaction to it and died. So it does happen. It's not something to be taken lightly. Most of the time we see, much less troublesome things, like maybe some mild nausea, maybe a skin rash. That's kind of the more common thing. But serious things can happen. Okay, there is this trial. It's finished now, I believe, and it was in the UK on Parkinson's disease. And really, really interesting, because they thought that they had come up with an idea. What they were actually doing, it was really interesting. They were implanting a little port on the side of the head, and that port had 4 little tiny catheters that they threaded through into the base of the brain. And they infused something, I think it was every 4-week infusion into that brain tissue. And the people who were running the trial and the patients allowed BBC to bring their cameras in and film anything and everything that they wanted to. So again, this is something that's on TV, really, really interesting. All you have to do is search on the web and you'll find it. And let's see if this link will work. It'll probably make me sign in again. Nope, good. Okay. Try not to blast you out.
And 42 men and women are about to take part in one of the world's most ambitious medical trials. A search for a cure for Parkinson's.
We're asking people to have experimental brain surgery. We're asking people to have an experimental device inserted into their heads. I'm going to drive the needle again, okay? It's fine. We're asking people to have an experimental drug. We could do great harm here, and we could genuinely make people worse than they are before they started.
For the last 6 years, cameras have been given unprecedented access to film a clinical trial from start to finish. A world-first look behind the scenes of what it takes to get a new drug to market. From the scientists who believe they have a breakthrough drug for Parkinson's.
I know the drug. It's know how you get it in the right dose, in the right place, at the right time.
To the volunteers who put their lives on the line for medical science.
This chance doesn't come along. For many people to be part of a trial that truly shifts medicine.
It's a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, where only half get the real drug and half just a placebo. No one knows who's getting what. Not even the doctors.
To have a huge operation like that and then have to have a placebo? Is that human? Not really, is it?
Why do we do it? We want to live longer. That's the truth.
For some, there are remarkable transformations.
It's medical. What happens here is...
For others, disappointment and setback.
Oh, sorry, you don't do. It's not the best.
You know what? I hope he's not on the drug.
I don't know to do that.
If this is as good as it gets, I'd be pissed off.
Could this be the miracle drug millions of Parkinson's sufferers worldwide have been waiting for?
See you on the other side.
was diagnosed with Parkinson's 11 years ago.
I've been trapped in my own body. I'm desperate to get out. That's what it feels like. I just think I've got this for a reason. I believe you've got to have trials. Okay. I want to make a difference for somebody. If it's not me, I want to make a difference for somebody else.
Darren thinks he was on placebo in the first half of the trial. This is his fourth infusion of GDNF since the start of the second 9 months.
Something's happening. I don't know what, I'm not reading into it, but something is definitely happening. Up, down, up, down, up, down. And the more I'm doing it, the more I'm smiling. I'm thinking, this ain't real, this ain't real. And then I go downstairs and I start screaming, Jane, come see this, come see this. And she's going, what's the matter with you, what's the matter with you? She got up and I said, you've got to film this, this is unbelievable. Oh dear. I never expected none of this, and I've never seen it coming.
That's really amazing.
To be honest with you, it scared me a little bit. Before I had Parkinson's.
It's pretty impressive. Well, you'll be interested to know that the statistical analysis of this study showed there was not a significant difference between the people getting the infusion and the people not getting the infusion. How can that be? You see this man, you see this woman in the first clip, she's doing this, and at first, this is the fastest she can go. And in the second one, she's zooming and just shocked at herself, and he's shocked at himself. So this was a small study. It was a phase 1 study. And there weren't, I think there were, what'd they say, 42 people in the study. So only a few of them had results like that, and the rest of them did not. So what do you do as a researcher? This is something, I work with a group of, they're called the Oncology Patient Advocates for Clinical Trials. And it's a group of people who have or had cancer and went through a clinical trial, and they volunteer to do community work. And this is something that we've often spoken about in our meetings is, what do researchers do about those outlier patients who do fantastic and get a wonderful result, but the study is still what we call has negative results? It's not statistically significant. Well, they're starting to look a little bit more at things like that. It takes a very curious and persistent researcher to look at those few outliers, and we certainly hope that there will be more and more of them because, hey, if 5 people out of 100 get a wonderful response, but it's not enough to make it statistically significant, we can't write off that 5% of people. So some terms that you've heard by now, I just wanted to make sure you understand them completely. A protocol is the written document that details everything about a study. It is the entire recipe A to Z. It includes the background research, the animal research, any prior studies that had anything to do with the study that they're working on now. Then it includes eligibility criteria and ineligibility criteria, which is kind of a thorn in our side. We would put a lot more patients on studies if the ineligibility criteria weren't so tough. And the NCI and the NIH are actually trying to work on that right now to get rid of maybe some of those guidelines that don't serve us real well. You know, we'll see what happens. And then the exact treatment, how it's going to be given, what to do about side effects, what side effects need to be monitored for, right down to the statistics that they're going to use to evaluate the study. So everything is in the written protocol, and that is my Bible. I work with protocols all day long. My office is full of them. I've got them everywhere. All of us do, everyone working in cancer research. So the protocol is what we follow, and we have to follow everything that's in there exactly as it's written. Unfortunately, they don't always write them perfectly, so that makes things a little challenging, but we do we consult with the groups that do write the protocols and let them know when they've left something out or put something in that perhaps shouldn't have been in there. Standard of care I already talked about, and that is whatever is normal now for whatever disease you're talking about. Now, placebo, I said I would mention that. Placebo has such a bad name. However, it can be an extremely useful thing. No one would ever be given a placebo unless it was in their consent form that they signed and were very aware that there was a potential for them to get a placebo. It is illegal, immoral, against all rules to give someone a placebo if they are not aware that they might be getting a placebo. So we're very careful about that. And then single-blinded and double-blinded studies. Single-blinded means the patient doesn't know if they're getting the placebo or the active treatment. And double-blinded means the doctors and the nurses taking care of the patient also don't know. Well, single-blinded doesn't always work. I have a wonderful friend who has often told me when he was on his study, the nurse told him that she thought he was getting the real thing, and because she had heard it from the pharmacist, and it was a regular topic of conversation. So double-blinded is much safer because there is a placebo effect on human beings. If you give someone who has, say, mild pain, a placebo, and you tell them, well, this might be a painkiller or it might be a placebo, they're probably going to have a slight decrease in their pain. That's what humans do. We respond when we think something is going to work for us. Now, rights of clinical trial participants. You guys break at 8, right? Oh, okay, I'll break at 8. The rights of clinical trial participants is a very important area of what we do. Informed consent is considered an ongoing process. It's not like when you go into the hospital to have your appendix out and you sign the paper that says you're having your appendix taken out, and then the informed consent is done, you have the operation and it's finished. Well, a clinical trial goes on over time, and we need to make sure that you are continually informed. You might forget something that we talked about before. There might be something new come up. There might be new information about the drug. We need to update you if there is anything new. And we need to continually make sure that people understand the clinical trial they're in. So here at Christiana Care, we've started using something called the teach back technique. And teach-back techniques just ensure that the participant really does understand, because we ask them, when you go home tonight and explain this to your son or whoever, how are you going to explain it? And we get them to tell us, well, how is it going to affect you? What could this possibly do to you? And we ask them to answer back and make sure that they truly are understanding and that we're teaching properly. Sometimes we say the wrong thing by accident. Sometimes we're not very clear. Sometimes we use medical jargon. And so these are all opportunities to use teach-back to make sure that informed consent really is informed. I just read through the questions and they're so good. So I'll start on them in a few minutes. I think one of them was about IRBs, so I'm going to pull up some IRB stuff here. That was actually next in my talk. But I will make sure that I answer all of those questions. So let's see if we can make these links work. Darn. They worked. I played with them and they finally worked. There we go.
Clinical trials. The most important member of any clinical trial team is you, the patient. So important that efforts to protect your safety begin even before the trial itself does. A clinical trial in the U.S. may only enroll patients after this protocol is approved by a group called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. IRB members include scientists, as well as nurses, advocates, and others. Their job is to monitor the clinical trials and protect participants' safety. The protocol describes the study's goals and methods, and outlines how the participants' safety will be ensured. IRB members review the protocol to make sure that the risk of harms is as low as possible, and that any potential harms are a reasonable part of a research study. Another important safety step is the informed consent process. Before you can join a trial, the research team will fully discuss the trial with you. If you decide to join, you will sign an informed consent form to confirm that you understand what's involved. You are encouraged to ask questions at any point before or after joining the study. And of course, you may always choose to leave the study. It's completely up to you. Once the study begins, its scientific progress and the safety of its participants are regularly monitored. The study may be changed or even stopped to ensure patient safety. Clinical trial participants are a vital part of cancer research. Better cancer care tomorrow depends on what we learn from clinical trials today. For more on how your safety is protected on clinical trials, visit the National Cancer Institute's website at cancer.gov/patient-safety. And thank you. U.S. Departments of Health and Human Institute.
Let's try for number 2. He told me how to fix it. Said hit it twice. Yay! Oh, darn. 3 times the charm. It just doesn't want to get big. We're leaving it like that. I'm afraid to touch it.
So in terms of research, and I think this is where a lot of the kind of scary things, like with that word research, you kind of can delve up some, like, if you don't understand or know it can sound scary. And so, and that doesn't come from nowhere, right? I mean, there have been things that have happened in the research world that have made people potentially worried about participating in research. I think particularly we're around risk. So am I going to increase the risk to my child, especially when you're making that decision for your child? And so the Belmont report is a really important document, and it bore out of actually some pretty horrific things that happened actually in clinical research that I won't get into. But the main 3 principles of the Belmont report are beneficence, respect for persons, and justice. And as a result of the Belmont report, a lot of regulation went into doing clinical trials in humans. And what bore out of that was something called the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, which every single institution, whether academic or non-academic, has if they're doing clinical trials. And this is a board of people who are doctors, scientists, but also people from the community. So if it's something that you're actually interested in doing, you might live close to an academic center, you might have a little bit of interest, every IRB is required to have a non-scientific, non-medical person on it. So if it's something that you think you might be interested in, it's something to volunteer for, and it can be quite rewarding. Beneficence is that it's holding us to a higher standard. So physicians, when they become physicians, take an oath that they shall do no harm. With research, we're taking an oath that we will benefit, not that we will do no harm, but that we need to have a belief that the research we're doing may benefit people and not just that it will harm them. With regard to respect for persons, it means that we can't just not consent you. Like, we have to let you know what we're doing. We have to respect you as people. And then with regard to justice, this is an interesting one, but it bore out of research that really was done potentially in other countries or underserved people that weren't actually going to benefit from the research themselves. So maybe like really expensive drugs that their country was never going to see or never going to get. So this became a really important issue with HIV research and stuff like that. But this was just essentially saying, you need to be doing the research on the people who might benefit from them. You can't expose other people to risk that may not ever get a benefit from what you're studying.
Okay, this last link is not a video. It takes you to a page that is about the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report came from a meeting of the minds back in 1974. The previous speaker mentioned some absolutely horrible things that had happened in research before, and she didn't want to get into it. And I'll just say a word or two. There was the Tuskegee experiment, which wherein in the 30s, I believe, 1930s, they enrolled African-American men from Tuskegee into a clinical observation trial. And this was men who had already contracted syphilis. So there is some misconception out there that they were infected with the syphilis by the researchers, but they were not. What happened was penicillin came along 20 years later, and the researchers decided it would mess up their study if they told the men about it. So there was a cure for their disease from 1945 or 50, and this study went on until I believe the very early 70s. And many men died. They transmitted the disease to wives and lovers, and it was a despicable, unethical display of behavior by the researchers. There are a number of other things that have happened. Back in the 50s, children at a mental institution were infected with hepatitis. There have just been some terrible things that have happened. But in the 70s, they got a group together, and as I said, it was a meeting of the minds, and they came up with the Belmont Report. And that's what she was talking about with beneficence, meaning, you know, you need to do good. And non-malfeasance, you can do no harm to someone on a clinical study without them being aware of it and the risks not outweighing the benefits to the patient. And justice is a very important part of the Belmont Report. And what that means is you cannot coerce people. You cannot subject people of a population who don't even have the problem with the treatment. It means treating people fairly. And so if you ever are looking for some real interesting reading material, take a look at this link and go to the Belmont Report. It will not disappoint. Whoop. Okay. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. What happens when the clinical trial is done? Well, results take a long time. They can take a year, they can take 2 years, sometimes 5 years later. I'm still getting secondary results from a study that closed 5 years ago. So they do take time. But one of the most important things that has happened regulatory-wise in the past probably eight years is this clinicaltrials.gov site was made. And this is a place where every research study needs to be listed by the sponsoring company or the NCI, whoever is doing the study. They have to enter the study information on clinicaltrials.gov, and then as soon as they have results, they are required to post the results there. This is a big deal because so many clinical trials were not releasing their results anywhere, especially clinical trials on children. It's like, if my child goes through a clinical trial, you better bet I want to see what those results are. And they were not being released. So now it is illegal to not release your results, and they are all on clinicaltrial.gov as is every single trial that's going on in the US is on there. Doctors often do researchers do poster presentations at medical and research conferences, but the most common way to get information out is to publish in a peer-reviewed medical or research journal. And peer-reviewed just means that people with similar backgrounds who are going to understand your research are going to be reviewing your article before it goes into a journal. They're not going to, supposedly, they're not going to allow fraudulent or false research results into a peer-reviewed journal. However, it has happened, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. One of the problems we have, Houston, we have a problem. Integrating clinical trial results into mainstream medicine. You wouldn't think that that would be a problem. You would think that it would be like that not the breast trial, the hormone replacement therapy trial, that it went out all over the news, and every doctor would start incorporating that news into their practice. That is not what happens. It takes a long time for any innovation, much less a clinical trial, a positive clinical trial, to be diffused through the medical field and utilized as it should be if it has a positive result. Actually, when I go to research conventions, they all have groups, diffusion of innovation groups, because they want to look at how they can get the word out. It's not enough just to do the study. If the study shows something good or helpful, we've got to get that word out. So, you know, just a few of the factors that affect whether or not an innovation is diffused throughout practice is the innovation itself. So think about fecal transplants. Do we really want to run out and start doing that? Not unless I've got C. difficile. So, you know, it's kind of a yucky treatment. We don't, you know, people aren't excited about it, whereas, you know, the result of the hormone replacement therapy, you know, that innovation was very simple to adopt. They just stopped taking a pill. The adopters, there can be the innovators themselves who come up with the ideas or the research. You can have early adopters or the early majority, late majority, and then you can have laggards, people who do not want to take on that new technology or innovation. And, you know, you'll see there might be an oncologist who just says, I just don't feel good about this particular treatment. I'm not going to adopt it for my patients. That's a reasonable thing because, you know, you would hope that if it was the right thing for the patient, that they would offer it, but maybe there's a bit of knowledge or something there that makes them think that it is not an appropriate thing to implement. Communication channels. The news is awesome. However, how inundated are we with news about clinical trial results? Research study showed this, research study showed that. Well, I'm sorry, it shows I can't eat eggs, I can't eat, you know, I can or I can't, or I don't know. It gets to be overload after a while. So it really takes good marketing like Humira. Boy, they've got the communication channel, don't they? They're getting right out there to everybody who's got an autoimmune disorder. It takes time to diffuse innovation, and social systems are important because we do everything, not in a vacuum, but within a social system. And if there are social mores or social opinions or social pressure to adopt or not adopt, that's going to affect that. Now I want to debunk. I want people to look at clinical trials with a critical eye. How many people were in that study? Was it a study of 42, like the C. difficile? Well, is that enough people to know? Well, it's not enough. I need to know more. I want to see a study with 200 or 300 or 400. So I like that idea that they're getting there, but a phase 1 study is not enough. You need phase 2 and phase 3 studies to really confirm that the treatment is safe and effective. Is it a randomized clinical trial? The RCT is the gold standard for a clinical trial. If it is not randomized, there is probably something wrong with it, okay? You need to look, again, very critical eye. And randomized just means, nowadays it's done by a computer. We put the name in, it goes to a server somewhere, goodness knows where, comes back and tells us, you're in arm 1. Arm 1 gets standard of care treatment. And then you're in arm 2. Arm 2 gets standard of care plus the new drug. So randomization is what really compares the two groups, the control group that's not getting the treatment and the treatment group that is getting the treatment. And that is the best way to do a clinical trial. You know, I don't understand a lot of statistics. I wish I did. I really enjoy it. I don't know why. But I want to read a peer-reviewed article that even if I can't understand the specific statistical analysis, I want to be able to understand the treatment, how they gave it, over how much time, how long the patients were on it, what was, you know, give me the details about the treatment, and then tell me about the statistical analysis. I might not understand the whole thing, but it should be written clearly so that you could, you know, consult someone about the statistics. It should just be transparent. It shouldn't be based on patients or caregivers or other people's, researchers' recollections. The best way to gather information is at the time something is happening. So when we send patients home with a bottle of experimental pills, we also send them home with a calendar to use as a diary, and they have to write down every time they take the pill. And that way, it's not a perfect confirmation, but it's better than asking them when they come in, hey, did you take all your pills? You know, you need a little bit more. And the main thing. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably isn't. So, the Women's Health Initiative, we saw this slide before. This is about the hormone replacement therapy. Here's what I want to tell you about that study. The mean age of participants was 63 years old, ranging from 50 to 79. That means they were giving estrogen in a fairly significant dose, and it was horse-derived estrogen, to women who were 63 on average. Now, that's not how it's prescribed. It is usually given to someone who is peri or just postmenopausal. So if somebody's having a terrible time with hot flashes or postmenopausal symptoms, this study does not really offer us the information we need because they're not going to be 63 years old. You're probably 10 years out from menopause if you're 63. So even this very good study that gave us great information was not necessarily applicable to how most women would take hormone replacement therapy. This is just a terrible copy of Andrew Wakefield's notoriously fraudulent article that was in a peer-reviewed journal in, oh God, what year was it? I knew it. It's gone now. 1990 something. And he did fraudulent research and he doctored up all of his notes, and then he published this study that said the MMR vaccine caused autism, GI problems, and it was a complete fake, but it fooled so many people. You know, if you don't have that high degree of suspicion, you can get roped into this, but it was absolutely not true, and another very large study was just completed, and the results show that they cannot make any kind of a link between autism and vaccines. This was another just shameful study. This fellow, this doctor from South Africa, falsified data. He said that bone marrow transplant and high-dose chemotherapy for advanced breast cancer would save lives. His research article showed that. We started implementing this around the world. Women with breast cancer were going through bone marrow transplants with high-dose chemotherapy, despite the fact that his research actually showed that it was of no use. I don't know about you, but a bone marrow transplant's an awful rough treatment, and I would not want to go through one unless I absolutely had to. This was despicable, and some American scientists visited his lab and determined that his records weren't correct. So that was retracted. Now, about a month ago on my Apple News, I'm addicted to Apple News. Like every minute that I have, I'm on Apple News, usually looking at videos of dogs on BuzzFeed. But it's my addiction. But this article came up on Apple News that said Israeli team announces cure for cancer within 1 year. And they said, we believe we will offer in a year's time a complete cure for cancer. And what cracks me up is the treatment was called Mutato. We're going to use a combination of cancer-targeting peptides and a toxin that will specifically kill cancer cells, and it will be effective from day one, will last a duration of a few weeks, and will have no or minimal side effects at a much lower cost than most other treatments on the market. Sound too good to be true? Well, it is. They were still in very early mouse studies. They had no right, it was just a total letdown to people who read this and hoped, wow, maybe there is something out there. And some people, for some reason, are sick enough to prey on those with cancer. I don't get it. There's something wrong in their brains, but that's what happens. And this is exactly what they were doing, touting a cure for cancer within a year. They haven't even done a phase 1 study yet. Clinicaltrials.gov. This was somebody's question, so here's where you can find a list. Oh, my mouse doesn't work. It's a funky mouse. Oh, it probably won't let me go anywhere. Clinicaltrials.gov. This is what I referred to earlier, and they've got an area, find a study. This is not the easiest website to work around, and so I just wanted to show that you can do an advanced search and come up with maybe a little bit better information. So you can put in the condition or disease. So I'm just going to put in breast cancer. How about we put in stage 3? A study type. Let's just do interventional studies or clinical trials, drug studies. Study results. I don't want studies with results because I want a trial that's open now. So I'm going to do studies without results. And let's do recruiting. So they're looking for patients. I'm going to do the adult population 18 to 64. And I'm going to leave all of this, except I do think I want phase 2 and phase 3, because that's going to be the most common. I guess I can do phase 1 too. I just want to show you National Cancer Institute or National Institutes of Health trials, because if we start adding all the pharmaceutically sponsored trials, we'll get a really long list. And then if you search, you're probably, oh, I meant to put in Delaware, but you don't need to see that. So here are the studies that it's listing. You can put in a particular place, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania. That can be extremely helpful in finding a clinical trial if you're looking for a clinical trial for yourself or for someone else. You can see all of these are recruiting. This one's new on the market. And if you just click on this, click on the name, it'll give you more information than you ever wanted. But probably some of the most important information is the objectives. So they're going to determine the safety of an intradermal administration of StemVac, whatever that is. And then you want to see if eligibility criteria is there. And so there's inclusion criteria for eligibility criteria, and it's all listed there. So that can be extremely helpful if a family member or a friend needs you to do a search. Also, I'm sorry, I don't, I'll give this with the PowerPoint. the way to get in touch with me. And if anybody ever needs help doing a search, you're welcome to contact me. And that is part of what I like to do, is hook people up with what they need. So feel free to contact me anytime. Yep, I think I'm done here. Okay, so there is a little bit of further reading. If you're interested, I really do urge you to look at the Parkinson's trial and the first in human. And then there's an interesting research study that the government is putting together. It's NIH sponsored, National Institutes of Health. And it's called the All of Us Research Study. And you can actually go on and join that and be a part of an enormous, essentially observation study that will reveal a lot of great information over time. So let me answer some questions here. All right, are there clinical trials for the impaired? Yes, but sometimes there are exclusion criteria that would not allow people with certain impairments. And if there is something like that, then a person with a particular impairment might not be able to. Can clinical research cure diabetes? Yes, I believe it is curing it now. I think within 10 years, we're going to have a cure for diabetes. That's my guess. Is there a list of current clinical trials? Yes, right there on clinicaltrials.gov. And are you looking for control group participants? I really like that. And if so, how can I volunteer? Thank you so much, whoever wrote that. We're not right now, but watch the newspaper, because there might be a time when we are. Can you explain what the IRB is? And I kind of went over that a little bit. What happens if a participant dies during the clinical trial? If they die from the treatment, if it is likely from the treatment, they're going to close down that trial. If the patient dies from their disease or from something else, then the clinical trial will likely continue. If a person improves after taking a placebo, was that person truly sick in the first place? Yes, they were, and that response of getting a little bit better will not last forever. Is Christiana Hospital going to participate in Reiki research, and is Reiki being used now? I don't know the answer to that. That would not, I don't have an answer to that, and I apologize. I know it's not routinely being used now. In each different phase level, do you start all over with an entirely new group of people? Now, the people in phase 1 would remain a phase 1 participant, and then we would enroll people into the phase 2 part. So all new people in each phase, generally. Although in some treatment trials, like the Parkinson's trial, if the patient got the placebo first or the observation first, they are often offered the treatment at the end of that number of weeks that they're on. Like this guy was on like 40 weeks of either placebo or observation, and then at the end of that they transferred him over to get the real drug. So they often do that. Let me come back to that one. This is a great question. What's the baseline percentage of success required in a clinical trial for a treatment or drug to be considered a success? Well, it has to be statistically significant, and that is a statistical process of analysis that would take a long time to answer. But I will say that I think 90% of new drugs do not make it past the trial phase and don't get approved by the FDA. So that kind of puts it in perspective. You have to have good results from a phase 1 trial in order for a phase 2 trial to come after it. So you have to have some positive results. You can't have made people terribly ill, and there has to be some sign that perhaps it's useful in that type of cancer. Why are prisoners a vulnerable population? It's because they have to do as they're ordered. They don't have free license to do whatever they want. So they can't willingly do an informed consent, because when you're in prison, you don't have that control. So it's a really good question. Great question. Is a clinical trial participant covered under his or her insurance? Who pays for side effects and other treatments? Clinical trial participants are told in their informed consent form what is covered by the study and what is not covered by the study. And Medicare has an agreement with the research community that they will not pay for the investigational drug, but they'll pay for the supportive care of the patient on the investigational drug. So if they develop side effects, Medicare will pay for that, and most insurances cover that as well. What are the opportunities for a job or internship in clinical research here? Please email me at mhayden@christianacare.org. I have some information for you. mhayden@christianacare.org. This one's just too tough. Do trials ever use addictive drugs? I assume they do, but thank goodness I don't have to deal with that. That's all I've got to say. The opioid epidemic is just way out of my league. How can at least a standard of care be followed when a placebo is used? So if you have a placebo being used, that is in place of the investigational drug, but you're still going, both groups are still going to get the standard of care. So let's say Cytoxin chemotherapy is what everybody gets when they get breast cancer. So you're going to go on a trial where everybody in the trial will get the Cytoxin, but then half the people might get a placebo and half the people might get a brand new drug. So does that make sense? Okay. All right, that's it for questions. Please email me if you have any more. I'll make sure that you have my email address. Thank you so much for your patience and courtesy.